Hi, everybody. Ian Bremmer here with a quick take on coronavirus. By far, the most important global crisis of the Trump administration, but frankly, the largest that we've experienced since the 2008 financial crisis. And putting it in that context is very important. Back in 2008, massive economic slowdown, the largest since the Great Depression, but very significant domestic response, rallying around both Presidents Bush and Obama, Congress coming together for significant stimulus and bailout, also American allies and even would-be adversaries through the G20 trying to coordinate to build consumer confidence and to avoid falling into a depression. Very different environment today. First of all, the divisions inside the United States. Virtually no goodwill for President Trump on the part of those Americans that oppose him politically, which means the level of opposition to him, no matter what he does or how effective the American response to coronavirus, is going to be very high. Also, the lack of global coordination. There's a lot of interest on the part of individual countries to respond to the challenges they're having in coronavirus. We see in Italy, need for fiscal expansion, a likelihood of a supplementary budget. In Japan, they had already seen their economy slip significantly in the fourth quarter of 2019. Here in the United States, both fiscal and monetary responses likely to be seen over the course of the coming months. But a complete lack of coordination, willingness to coordinate, interest or orientation to coordinate on the part of the Americans, on the part of the Europeans, on the part of the Chinese. Now, it's interesting on China specifically that President Trump has been saying, including yesterday, don't beat up on the Chinese. They have enough problems of their own right now. But he's the only one that's saying that. Certainly in the Trump administration, there are many who see this as an opportunity to bring more manufacturing of medicines and supply chain, for example, back to the United States. Opportunity for jobs, outsourcing to be brought back to the U.S. That's very consistent with Trump's policies on trade and on manufacturing and jobs. And if it looks like the American economy is going to take a hit over the next few months, and that might play through in the U.S. elections for Trump, the likelihood that he would suddenly turn and start blaming the Chinese goes up. Remember, during the presidential debate earlier this week, the one person who responded coherently to coronavirus was former Vice President Joe Biden, who said Trump didn't force the Chinese to let the CDC in, let the Americans in early for a more effective response. I think you're going to hear a lot more of that from Trump's opponents on the Democratic side as this plays out in the United States, starts having an impact in the way we think about the American economy and the elections. One other scenario just to recognize is if we start to get actual disruptions in movement of people inside the U.S., as looks increasingly plausible. Remember, just now in Japan, you have an announcement of a complete shutdown of all schools until April. If we see that kind of thing in the U.S., the potential that this plays out in primaries, in the election, in making it difficult for people to get to places, to ballot boxes, for example, to the actual voters' voting places, and as a consequence impacting turnout, maybe have calls that these elections have not been handled properly, or there should be a delay, or that someone did better or worse. As a consequence of that, the politicization of the election process itself, which already was dramatically higher than we've seen in generations, is going up. Coronavirus starting to play out. So those are some of the big implications directly for the Americans. And on the macro front, let's keep in mind that also in emerging markets where you have much less capacity to respond, the danger politically for a lot of these governments is going to be higher. So, for example, in a place like Mexico, where Lopez Obrador has had over 70% approval consistently since he's won, but it's starting to be a bit softer, in part because there's been very poor security on the ground in the country. The economics in Mexico look bad. They've just had to downgrade growth for the rest of the year. If coronavirus breakouts become significant inside Mexico, and certainly that would be expected in the case of a global pandemic, suddenly López Obrador looks very vulnerable as a political leader. There will be leaders like that in emerging markets in particular all around the world, very disruptive of their economic reform plans, very disruptive of political stability in these countries. So the fact that coronavirus is coming as the economy globally was turning into a softer cycle, as people were more concerned about growth, as social instability was growing, as populism and political polarization was growing, particularly in emerging markets that are much more vulnerable to all of those shifts, that's something that we should be paying attention. Markets do a pretty good job of pricing in one significant risk. You've seen we're in correction territory this week, a 10% contraction from record highs in the Dow. But as soon as the markets kind of figure out, we understand coronavirus, we know how big it's likely to get, it'll take a big hit, but it'll price it in and it'll start becoming normal trading sessions again. Very different if coronavirus actually starts aligning with another risk. Then you're in much more unprecedented territory, whether that risk is emerging markets starting to fall or it's the U.S. elections becoming more polarized. As someone who focuses on the global macro, that's what I'm particularly concerned about going forward. So anyway, that's a few moments from me. Hope everyone's good. See you all next week.